At 14, my parents forced me to pay $600 rent or get out. Hey everyone, thanks for clicking on this video. What I'm about to share with you is probably the hardest story I've ever had to tell. It's about how my own parents tried to charge me rent when I was just 14 years old, and how I had to fight back to survive. This isn't easy to talk about, but I think it's important that people understand what some kids go through behind closed doors. So let me take you back to when I was 12 years old. That's when everything changed. I was sitting at the kitchen table one afternoon, and Mom slid a permission slip across to me for a field trip. As I signed it, she said something that caught me completely off guard. Now that you're 12, you can start buying your own school lunch. We're not made of money, and you need to understand the value of hard work. I just stared at her, confused. I thought maybe she was joking, but her face was dead serious. That same week, she stopped buying me school supplies entirely. When I asked for new notebooks and pencils, she waved me off. Figure out yourself, she said. Other kids your age have jobs. You should think about getting one too. I felt so embarrassed. Here I was, asking my teachers for extra supplies while my dad sat in the living room watching his premium sports package that cost more per month than my entire school supply list would have been. They'd just bought a brand new 60-inch TV, but somehow couldn't afford a $10 box of pencils for their daughter. So I did what I had to do. I started babysitting on weekends and walking dogs after school just to afford basic things like notebooks, pens, and even food. The shame of wearing pants that were too short and shoes with holes in them burned in my chest every single day. But I tried to act normal, like everything was fine. Dad would see me come home exhausted and say, "Look at our little entrepreneur. Maybe now you'll understand why we can't just hand you everything." I'd force a smile and nod, while mentally calculating how to make $25 stretch for a week's worth of meals. By the time I turned 13, things got even worse. My parents completely stopped buying me food. They'd order takeout for themselves twice a week, and I'd come home starving to find them eating restaurant food while the cabinets were completely empty. Mom would look at me and say, "You could get a job at the grocery store and buy your own food like an adult," all while eating her Chinese takeout right in front of me. The smell of their food made my stomach ache so badly. I learned to just stay in my room until they finished eating, so I wouldn't have to watch them enjoy meals I couldn't afford. Here's the crazy part though. Because I had to make every single dollar count, I actually became better with money than my parents ever were. While they impulsively bought new electronics and ordered restaurant meals constantly, I researched every purchase and looked for the best deals. I built up a small business doing yard work and pet sitting that brought in decent money. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, a teenager, showing more financial responsibility than two grown adults. Yet they still had the nerve to criticize me for being poor because I wore thrift store clothes. I'll never forget what Mom said at a family gathering when I showed up in a secondhand outfit. "It's embarrassing having a daughter who dresses like she's homeless. People are going to think we don't take care of you." I wanted to scream. They didn't take care of me. They hadn't bought me clothes in 2 years. Dad would complain to his friends about how expensive kids are, while I sat right there knowing I'd been financially independent since middle school. He'd tell people, "See what happens when you stop enabling kids and make them work for what they want. She understands the value of a dollar now, unlike these spoiled brats whose parents give them everything." He'd say this while drinking $40 bottles of wine and playing golf at the country club every weekend. Then Dad lost his job, and suddenly their whole attitude toward money changed overnight. Mom came to me looking stressed. "We're having some financial troubles. Could you lend us money for groceries? Just until your father finds something new." I watched them panic about possibly missing their mortgage payment. These were the same people who'd forced me to budget down to the last penny for years. They had no savings despite making good money because they'd spent every dollar on wants instead of needs. "You've got all that money sitting in your account," Dad said. "Family helps family during hard times." I reminded him that when I was 12, family apparently didn't help family. When I was eating peanut butter for dinner every night while they ordered takeout, family didn't help then. "That was different," Mom insisted. "We were teaching you responsibility. This is a real emergency." They kept asking me for money every few days, getting angrier each time I said no. You're being selfish and ungrateful after everything we've done for you, Dad said during one of his begging sessions. We could have kicked you out years ago, but we let you stay here for free. I pointed out that allowing your minor child to live in your home was literally the bare minimum legal requirement for parents. Don't get smart with us, Mom snapped back. Then came the day that changed everything. I was in my room working on homework when both my parents walked in with serious expressions on their faces. We've been talking, and we think it's time you started contributing to household expenses, Mom said, with Dad nodding behind her. You're 14 now, and making decent money. It's only fair that you pay rent. Dad stepped forward, holding a printed contract. You can either pay $600 a month plus utilities, or you can find somewhere else to live. I stared at the paper in his hands. My mind went completely blank for a second. The document had official-looking headers and signature lines. $600 a month plus utilities meant I'd be spending nearly everything I earned, leaving almost nothing for food or emergencies. I did the math quickly in my head. On a good month, I made around $700 from my lawn care business and pet sitting. The utilities in this house ran at least $200 during summer when they cranked the AC. That would leave me maybe $100 for everything else: food, clothes, school supplies, gas for my mower. My parents stood there expecting me to just sign. Mom had her arms crossed. Dad held out a pen. I told them I needed time to think about it and went to my room before they could argue. Dad called after me, saying I was being dramatic, but I shut my door anyway. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my budget notebook and ran the numbers. It confirmed what I already knew. This would destroy everything I'd built. I'd been so careful with money for the past 2 years. I'd saved over $1,500 for emergencies and college application fees. If I paid them rent, my savings would be gone in 3 months. I'd have nothing left to cover the basic necessities they'd stopped providing. I wrote out different scenarios, but they all ended the same way. There was no version of this that worked without me going hungry or losing my business equipment. My eyes got watery, though I wasn't really crying. The notebook pages just got a little blurry. I was just angry and scared, trying to figure out what to do. That night, I stayed up late on my phone researching whether parents could legally charge their underage children rent. The answers were complicated and varied by state, but most sources agreed that parents have a legal obligation to provide basic support until their child turns 18. Some forums had people claiming their parents charged them rent as teenagers, and it was fine. Others said it was neglect if the parents weren't providing food and necessities. One legal aid website said parents are required to provide their children with shelter, food, clothing, medical care, and education. Charging rent might be acceptable if they're still providing all those other necessities. But my parents hadn't bought me food in over a year. They hadn't bought me clothes since I was 12. I screenshot everything that seemed relevant and saved it to a folder on my phone. I finally fell asleep around 1 a.m. with my phone still in my hand. The next morning, I told my parents I wouldn't sign anything until I talked to someone at school about it. We were in the kitchen, and they were eating breakfast they'd bought only for themselves. Dad's face turned red, and he started yelling about disrespect. He said I was being ungrateful, and they had every right to charge me rent. Mom jumped in, saying I was acting like a spoiled brat who thinks she's too good to help her family. My heart was racing, but I stayed calm. I explained that I just wanted to make sure I understood everything before signing a legal contract. Dad slammed his coffee mug down on the counter, spilling coffee everywhere. He moved toward me, but I grabbed my backpack and left for school early. I could hear him yelling behind me as I walked down the driveway, but I didn't look back. At school, I went straight to the counselor's office. Miss Thompson had always been kind whenever I'd seen her in the hallways. The secretary asked if I had an appointment. I told her it was an emergency, and she looked at me for a long moment before picking up the phone. Miss Thompson came out a few minutes later and led me into her office. She had gray hair, wore a cardigan even though it was warm outside, and her office had plants on the windowsill with motivational posters on the walls. I told her everything. About being 12 when they stopped buying lunch and supplies. About working since middle school to pay for food and clothes. About them ordering takeout while I ate peanut butter. About the thrift store clothes. About Dad's contract that I had to sign. Ms. Thompson listened to everything without interrupting. When I finished, she looked genuinely concerned. She asked if I felt safe at home, if my parents had ever been physically aggressive. They hadn't. They'd never hit me or threatened to hurt me physically. They just stopped taking care of me financially and now wanted me to pay them. Miss Thompson's expression got serious. She said that while she wasn't a lawyer, charging a minor child rent raised serious questions about parental obligations. Parents are legally required to provide their children's basic needs until they turn 18. If they're charging rent but not providing food or clothing, that could be considered neglect. She pulled out some pamphlets about free legal aid services and asked if I'd be okay with her making some calls to connect me with someone who could give me real legal advice. Yes, please, I said. I need help figuring this out. Ms. Thompson stepped outside to make a call. Through the window in her door, I could see her talking to someone and taking notes. When she came back, she told me she'd left a message with legal aid and they should call back within a day or two. The relief I felt was overwhelming. For the past 2 years, I'd been handling everything alone and pretending it was normal. Having an adult actually listen and take me seriously made me want to cry, but I held it together. Ms. Thompson also helped me apply for free lunch right there in her office. Something I should have done years ago, but was too embarrassed to ask about. When I left her office, I felt lighter than I had in months. Someone knew. Help was coming. I wasn't completely alone anymore. The next day, I met with James Carter from Legal Aid. Ms. Thompson had arranged the meeting and took me to the legal aid office downtown after school. James looked younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, wearing glasses and a tie. His office was small with file boxes stacked everywhere. He asked me to start from the beginning and tell him everything. I went through the whole story again, and he took notes the entire time. When I got to the part about the rent contract, he stopped writing and looked up. Charging rent could be considered neglect if it prevents them from fulfilling their obligations, he said. Parents are legally required to support their minor children. They can't just decide to stop providing necessities and charge rent instead. James asked detailed questions about what my parents provided versus what I paid for myself. When I listed everything, food, clothes, school supplies, toiletries, his expression got more serious. He made 2 columns, provided and not provided. The not provided list was way longer. He asked about their income, whether they were actually struggling financially or just choosing not to spend money on me. I told him about the sports package, the golf membership, the restaurant meals. How they'd had plenty of money until Dad got laid off a few months ago. James nodded and kept writing. He asked if I had any proof of what I was telling him. I showed him photos on my phone. Their takeout containers piled in the trash while my cupboards were empty. Pictures of a locked pantry, my budget notebook showing every dollar I'd earned and spent for the past 2 years. James looked through everything carefully. His jaw tightened. He closed his notebook and leaned back in his chair. This documentation is solid evidence, he said. It's exactly what we need if things escalate to court or child services. He explained that he could send my parents a formal letter outlining their legal obligations as parents of a minor child. The letter would cite specific state laws about food, shelter, clothing, and basic necessities. It wouldn't force them to change, but it might make them realize they can't just push me out or demand all my money. The letter would be professional and factual, not threatening, but it would make clear that their actions could be considered neglect. He asked if I wanted him to send it. I said yes immediately. Having something official from a lawyer made me feel safer than I'd felt in years. James printed out some information sheets about my rights and told me to keep documenting everything. He also gave me his direct phone number in case things escalated quickly. The meeting ended with him promising to send the letter within a few days. That evening, I was heating up ramen in the microwave when my parents cornered me in the kitchen. They had that serious look on their faces again. Dad crossed his arms. Have you thought about the rent contract? I took a deep breath and told them I'd spoken with a lawyer from legal aid. Mom's face went pale. Dad's jaw clenched. I explained that I'd learned parents have to provide basic necessities for their children regardless of whether they pay rent. Dad's face turned red, and he started yelling about how I was threatening them and making them look like terrible parents. His voice got louder with each sentence. Mom burst into tears, accusing me of being ungrateful after 14 years of them providing for me. She was crying to make me feel guilty, but I'd seen her do this too many times to fall for it. Dad stepped closer, yelling that I was tearing this family apart over money. I stayed calm and repeated what James had told me. I said I was happy to help with household chores and contribute in appropriate ways, but I wouldn't sign a contract that took all my earnings. My hands were shaking, but my voice stayed steady. I told them I needed that money for food and school supplies, since they'd stopped providing those years ago. Dad opened his mouth to yell again, but I just turned and walked to my room. They were both screaming about disrespect and ingratitude behind me, but I kept walking. I heard them stomp off to their bedroom, slamming the door so hard the whole house shook. I locked my bedroom door and sat on my bed, texting Ms. Thompson that the confrontation had happened and I was okay. She texted back immediately asking if I was safe. I said yes, but shaken. The house stayed quiet for the rest of the night. The next week passed with my parents barely speaking to me. Then one afternoon while I was at school, James's letter arrived by certified mail. I knew because when I got home that evening, the whole atmosphere of the house felt different. The air was thick and tense. My parents were sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread out in front of them. They didn't look at me when I walked in. Didn't say a word. I grabbed a snack from the limited supplies I could find and went straight to my room. In some ways, the silence was worse than the yelling. I could hear them talking in low, angry tones through dinner, which I usually avoided, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. This went on for days, them treating me like I was invisible while simultaneously watching my every move. Ms. Thompson started checking in with me almost daily at lunch. She brought me into her office, and we worked on creating a realistic schedule that balanced school, work, and study time. My grades had been slipping because I was too tired and stressed to focus on assignments. She emailed my teachers explaining I was dealing with family issues and helped me get extensions on missed work. We figured out which classes needed the most attention and when I could use my free time to catch up. She also connected me with the school's homework help program that offered free tutoring. Ms. Thompson made a spreadsheet covering my entire week, school hours, work shifts, study blocks, even time for sleep. Seeing everything laid out helped me realize how much I'd been trying to juggle alone. My neighbor, Mrs. Martinez, noticed I was bringing my lawn equipment to her garage more often than usual. One day when I was storing my mower and trimmer, she came outside and asked if everything was okay at home. I gave her a vague answer about my parents having financial troubles. Mrs. Martinez looked at me for a long moment, like she was debating whether to push for more information. She didn't push, but her expression told me she understood more than I was saying. She mentioned that her garage had plenty of space if I wanted to store all my equipment there permanently instead of just sometimes. I thanked her and took her up on the offer, relieved that my expensive tools would be safe from my parents' interference. Over the next week, Mrs. Martinez started giving me more steady work. She asked if I could mow her lawn every week instead of every other week and help with some garden maintenance too. She paid me up front for the whole month, which helped me budget better and feel less stressed about money. While I was working in her yard one Saturday, she brought out lemonade and casually mentioned that her guest room was available if I ever needed a place to stay. She said it in an offhand way, like she was just making conversation, but her eyes were serious. I thanked her and told her I really appreciated it. Having that option in the back of my mind made me feel less trapped. At home, things got worse in subtle ways. My parents started locking the pantry door and counting every item in the fridge. They didn't outright deny me food, but they made it clear what I was allowed to touch. Certain shelves in the refrigerator were off-limits, and the pantry stayed locked unless they were home to supervise. It was their way of controlling my food without breaking any obvious rules. I'd come home from work hungry and find the pantry locked with a note saying they'd be home at 8. Meanwhile, I could smell their leftover Chinese food in the fridge, but I wasn't supposed to touch it. I started documenting everything on my phone like James had instructed. I took pictures of the locked pantry with timestamps. Photos of the empty cupboards I was allowed to access, showing there was almost nothing there. When my parents ordered takeout, I photographed the bags and containers in the trash, then took pictures of my own meals, usually peanut butter on toast or plain noodles. I took photos of their bank statements, showing their restaurant charges. Every piece of evidence got saved in a folder on my phone, then backed up to a cloud account they couldn't access. James had said evidence matters if things escalate to court or child services. I never imagined I'd be building a case against my own parents, but here I was, taking photos in my own kitchen like I was gathering evidence for a criminal investigation. My next shift at the grocery store, my manager Kevin approached me during a slow period. He'd been watching me check out with my usual lunch items, the cheapest stuff in the store, and he looked at me with understanding rather than pity. He mentioned they had openings for extra hours if I was interested, and the income would help with whatever I was going through. I accepted immediately. More consistent income meant less worry about affording rent or buying food. He told me to stop by his office after my shift to fill out the paperwork, and I thanked him as I bagged my crackers and peanut butter. I filled out the forms that same day, and Kevin helped me update my work permit to allow for more hours since I was still 14. The new schedule started later that week, 3 weekday evening shifts plus full weekends, resulting in consistent pay. But it also meant less time for schoolwork, and I was already behind in 2 classes due to the stress at home. Miss Thompson caught me falling asleep in study hall and pulled me aside to ask what was going on. I explained about the increased work hours. She didn't lecture me about priorities or tell me to quit my job like some adults might. Instead, she helped me create a study plan that fit homework into every free period and lunch break. She even talked to my teachers about extensions on projects so I wouldn't get overwhelmed with late work. 3 days later, I got home after an evening shift to find Dad standing in the driveway with his arms crossed. Before I even got out of my car, he started yelling about how he knew I was getting free lunch at school. Someone from church must have seen my name on a list or something, because he knew information I'd never told him. He accused me of making them look like deadbeats who can't even feed their own kid. Said my poverty act was embarrassing the whole family. I tried to walk past him toward the house, but he blocked my path and kept ranting about how people at church were probably talking about what terrible parents they must be. His voice got louder with each sentence, and I saw Mrs. Martinez's porch light turn on across the street. She stepped outside and stood on her porch, arms crossed, watching us. Dad noticed her standing there and lowered his voice to an angry whisper, but I could see his jaw working and his fists clenching at his sides. He told me this conversation wasn't over and went back inside, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. The next weekend, I came home after mowing lawns to find my equipment sitting in the middle of the yard, completely soaked from the morning rain. My parents claimed they had no idea it was going to rain and needed to move the car out of the garage to run errands. But my mower wouldn't start. When I checked the engine, I found water damage that would cost more to fix than the mower was worth. I sat on the wet grass staring at my ruined equipment, and for the first time in months, I felt like crying. This mower represented half my business, and replacing it would take weeks of savings. Mrs. Martinez came over about an hour later and found me still sitting there trying to figure out what to do. She looked at the destroyed mower, then at my parents' car sitting dry in the driveway. She didn't ask any questions about what had happened. She just told me to bring all my equipment to her garage right now, and I could keep everything there permanently, so this never happened again. I picked up my trimmer and other tools and followed her across the street, grateful that at least one adult in my life was willing to help instead of sabotage me. Back at work, Kevin called me into his office and offered me a permanent part-time position with set weekly hours and a small raise. The stability meant I could plan my budget instead of scrambling for inconsistent yard work money. Every payday, I could count on a specific amount to cover my food and expenses. He also mentioned that employee discounts applied to groceries, which would make my food budget stretch much further. That next week, I was reorganizing my room when I caught Dad going through my stuff. My bank statements were out of order, and there were fingerprints on the papers in my desk drawer. I confronted him about it, and he acted like it was his right to know what I was doing with my money since I lived in his house. James's voice echoed in my head about keeping my finances separate. So I went online and set up a prepaid debit card account that only I could access. I transferred most of my money and arranged direct deposit from work so my parents could never check my income again. James had said documentation was important, and this was another layer of protection. Someone apparently confronted Dad directly about the rent situation at church that Sunday, because he came home furious about people gossiping about our private business. He slammed things around the kitchen while Mom sat at the table looking humiliated, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. She kept repeating they shouldn't have told anyone anything, but Dad insisted they didn't, implying someone else was talking. I stayed in my room listening to them argue about who found out and how to handle the rumors now circulating in their social circles. Ms. Thompson arranged a mediation meeting at the school the following Wednesday with my parents, herself, and a district social worker. We all sat around a conference table, and the social worker explained her role was to help us reach an agreement that worked for everyone. My parents immediately started complaining about how disrespectful I'd been and how I refused to help the family during hard times. Dad brought up every perceived slight from the past month, while Mom agreed and added her own examples. The social worker listened patiently before redirecting the conversation by asking what specific support my parents currently provided. The room went quiet as they tried to list actual expenses beyond the roof over my head. The social worker asked about food, clothes, and school supplies. My parents gave vague answers about teaching responsibility. She asked me directly what I paid for myself, and I listed everything: food, clothes, school supplies, toiletries. My parents sat there looking uncomfortable. After about 45 minutes of back and forth, we reached a temporary agreement where I wouldn't pay rent for now, but would contribute by doing extra chores around the house. The social worker documented everything in detail: which chores, how often, and what my parents agreed to provide in return. She printed copies for all of us and said this was a working agreement we'd revisit in a month. My parents signed it looking unhappy but agreeable, and I grabbed my copy, knowing this piece of paper gave me something official to point to if they tried to change the terms later. A few days later, I was coming home from school and saw Dad loading his golf clubs into someone else's car in the driveway. He handed over the clubs and accepted cash from the buyer, then watched the car drive away with a sad look on his face. Inside, he was counting money at the kitchen table, and I heard him mutter something about paying the credit card company before they sued him. He didn't ask me for money that whole week, which felt like progress, even though I could tell he was miserable about losing his golf stuff. Mom surprised everyone by announcing she'd been hired for a part-time job at a retail store in the mall. She started the following Monday and came home that first day complaining about standing for 6 hours straight and dealing with rude customers. Every evening after her shifts, she complained about being tired and her feet hurting. But it was strange seeing her actually work for the first time in years. The extra income was helping though. We started eating cheaper meals at home more often instead of ordering takeout. Mom cooked spaghetti with basic sauce, rice, and beans, cheap chicken dishes. It wasn't fancy, but it meant I wasn't hiding in my room eating peanut butter sandwiches while they ate restaurant food. I actually sat at the table with them during dinner, which hadn't happened in ages. One evening, Mom and I were alone in the kitchen washing dishes while Dad watched TV. She was scrubbing a pot and suddenly said her parents were very strict about money when she was growing up. She said they made her account for every penny and never let her buy anything fun. It wasn't an apology, and she didn't reference how she'd treated me, but it was the closest she'd ever come to explaining why she acted the way she did. I just nodded and kept drying dishes because I didn't know what to say. Dad got a call for an interview at a warehouse across town, and his whole mood shifted. For the first time in weeks, he seemed hopeful, talking about pay and benefits while looking up the company's website. The tension in the house eased slightly as we waited to hear if he'd made it to the next round. I used some of my savings to get my lawnmower repaired since the engine had been acting weird. The guy fixed it, and I bought better, longer-lasting equipment, a new trimmer, and some professional-grade tools. Mrs. Martinez saw me unloading everything and offered to let me organize her garage so all my business stuff would be in one place and easy to access. We spent Saturday afternoons setting up shelves and hanging tools on the wall. She labeled everything and even made a scheduling board so I could see which clients needed service each week. At work, Kevin started teaching me about payroll and taxes during slow hours when there weren't many customers. He showed me how to read my pay stub and explained withholdings and deductions. He talked about budgeting strategies and how to plan for big expenses. He treated me like a real adult employee instead of a kid, which felt amazing after years of being treated like a burden at home. James called to check in and see how things were going with my parents. I told him about the mediation agreement, and he suggested we create a safety plan in case they tried to push me out anyway. He had me write down Mrs. Martinez's phone number, Ms. Thompson's cell number, and the address of a youth shelter downtown. He explained exactly what to do if I came home and the locks had been changed or my stuff was gone. Knowing I had a plan made me feel less anxious about what might happen. My parents started cooking at home more often, and one day I realized the lock on the pantry was gone. Mom actually asked if I wanted anything special from the grocery store next time she went, which was bizarre. I almost couldn't believe it was happening. She mentioned I liked wheat bread and a certain brand of peanut butter. It felt weird but wonderful to be able to eat like a normal kid. Then I walked past the kitchen counter and saw the cable bill sitting there with the payment amount highlighted. When I picked it up, I noticed the sports package Dad had canceled weeks ago had been added back on. They were already reverting to their old spending habits. After all that progress, selling the golf clubs, cutting expenses, they couldn't help themselves. The bill was about $70 more than it should have been, and they hadn't even mentioned it to me. I put the paper down and walked back to my room, feeling that old frustration rising in my chest. They couldn't help themselves, even when they should have been learning better money habits. A few days later, I was doing homework in my room when I heard loud voices from the kitchen. Dad was angry about an overdraft notice from the bank, and Mom's voice got louder, saying she had no idea the account was that low. I cracked my door and heard Dad accusing her of overspending at Target, while she fired back about his bar tab from last weekend. They went back and forth listing every purchase the other person had made, neither taking responsibility for their own spending. The argument lasted about 45 minutes before they both stormed off to separate rooms, and I realized they'd learned nothing from the past few weeks. The next morning, Dad approached me before school and started talking about how household expenses were getting out of hand. He thought I should start contributing since the bills were too much for just the two of them to handle. I pulled out my phone and showed him a photo of our written agreement from the mediation meeting, the one that said no rent until I turn 18. He turned red in the face, but I stayed calm and told him we'd already agreed on terms. He muttered something about ungrateful kids and walked away, but I could tell he wasn't done trying. That evening, Mom approached me in the hallway with a fake cheerful expression and started talking about a new system she devised. She suggested that instead of calling it rent, we could use chore credits where I earned points for household tasks that counted toward helping with bills. I stared at her for a moment before responding. That just sounds like rent with extra steps, and the answer is still no. Her smile faded, and she huffed off to complain to Dad about how difficult I was being. I went to my room and texted James about what had just happened. He responded within minutes telling me to start documenting everything in more detail. I opened a new note on my phone and started recording what food was currently in the cabinets, when my parents bought pizza for dinner while I ate cereal, and photos of cash they left on the counter showing their spending habits. James had said if we needed to escalate things, having solid evidence would protect me from their version of events. Every day I made entries, noting when they ordered takeout, when the pantry had food I could use, and any comments they made about money or my supposed obligations. The documentation made me feel less powerless because I was creating a record of what actually happened rather than what they pretended. 3 days later, I was at school when Miss Thompson called me to her office and showed me an email she was about to send to my parents. The message was professional and kind, but the warning was clear. If the agreed-upon terms of our mediation were violated in any way, she'd have to file a formal report with Child Welfare Services. She asked if I was okay with her sending it, and I said yes, knowing my parents would be furious, but also understanding they needed this boundary enforced by someone with authority. She hit send while I was sitting there, and I watched the email disappear into cyberspace, headed for my parents' inbox where it would definitely cause an explosion. That Saturday, I was working my shift at the grocery store, restocking shelves in the cereal aisle, when I saw Dad walk through the front doors. My stomach dropped because he clearly wasn't there to shop, judging by the angry expression on his face and the way he scanned the store looking for me. He spotted me and walked straight over, his voice rising as he ranted about how I was making them look like terrible parents and turning everyone against them. Customers stopped to stare, and I could feel my face burning with embarrassment as he continued yelling about ingratitude and disrespect. Kevin came out from the back room and walked forward calmly, positioning himself between me and Dad. He told my father in a firm but polite tone that he needed to leave the store. Dad started claiming he had the right to talk to his own daughter. Kevin didn't back down. He just repeated that he had to leave immediately, or Kevin would call the police for causing a disturbance. Dad looked like he wanted to argue more, but something in Kevin's expression made him spin around and storm out, shoving the door open so hard it banged against the wall. I was shaking so badly, I had to sit down on a step stool, and Kevin and his assistant manager Sarah came over to check on me. Kevin said, "You did nothing wrong, and we've got your back completely." Sarah pulled out an incident report form and started writing down everything that happened, including times and details. She told me matter-of-factly that if Dad came back to the store, they wouldn't hesitate to call the police for trespassing. Knowing they were serious about protecting me made me feel safer than I'd felt in months. After my shift, I went straight to Ms. Thompson's house because she'd given me her home address for emergencies. I told her everything about the store incident. Her expression grew more troubled as I talked, and when I finished, she said she had to file that report with child welfare immediately because my father showing up at my workplace to confront me crossed a major line. The next day, a woman named Ms. Rodriguez called my cell phone and introduced herself as a caseworker. She said she needed to schedule a home visit to assess the situation. My whole body felt cold and relieved at the same time. I'd asked for help, but I was also terrified about what happens next and whether this would make things worse. Ms. Rodriguez scheduled the visit for Thursday afternoon, saying she'd need to speak with me privately, inspect the house, and go over some financial information with my parents. When I told my parents about the visit, they went into complete panic mode. Mom started deep cleaning every room like we were preparing for a military inspection. She scrubbed baseboards and organized closets that hadn't been touched in years. Dad coached her on what to say, rehearsing answers about how they provided everything I needed and claiming I was overreacting to normal family disagreements. I listened to them practice their version of events and decided not to participate in any of it. When Ms. Rodriguez arrived on Thursday, I planned to tell her the truth calmly and let her form her own conclusions based on facts rather than my parents' spin. Thursday came, and Ms. Rodriguez showed up right on time. She was a woman in her 40s with a professional but kind demeanor, carrying a tablet and briefcase. She started by asking all three of us general questions about our household and daily routines. Then she asked to speak with me alone in my room. I showed her my budget notebook, my documentation of food availability and spending patterns, and photos of bills from my phone. She didn't seem surprised or judgmental. She just took notes and asked clarifying questions about specific incidents and dates. After talking with me for over an hour, she walked through the house room by room, checking the pantry and fridge, and taking her own photos. Finally, she sat down with my parents in the living room, and I was asked to join them. Ms. Rodriguez spoke plainly and directly. She told my parents that charging rent to a minor child was inappropriate and could constitute neglect of their legal obligations. She said they needed to ensure I had consistent access to food and basic necessities, and she'd be monitoring the situation through follow-up visits. My parents nodded and agreed to everything she said, their faces a mixture of shame and resentment. But I could tell they understood. She wasn't offering suggestions. She was setting rules they had to follow. As Ms. Rodriguez packed up her tablet and folder and headed to the door, my parents followed her with tight smiles. The second her car pulled away from the curb, the fake friendliness vanished. Mom went straight to the pantry and removed the lock without saying a word, throwing it in the trash with more force than necessary. Dad pulled out his phone and started scrolling through job postings while sitting at the kitchen table, his mouth set in a tight line. Neither of them looked at me or acknowledged what had just happened, but I could feel their anger radiating through every corner of the house. Over the next several days, they bought groceries and placed them where I could reach them. But they arranged the items in a deliberate way, like they wanted me to know they were only doing this because they had to. Mom sighed loudly every time she put food in the fridge. Dad muttered under his breath about government overreach and people not minding their own business. The rent contract disappeared from the counter, but nobody mentioned it, as if pretending it never existed could somehow fix everything. I kept my documentation up to date anyway, taking photos of the unlocked pantry and stocked fridge just in case things changed again. 2 weeks after Ms. Rodriguez's visit, Dad started his warehouse job on the night shift loading trucks. He left for work around 9 p.m. and got home at 6 a.m., sleeping most of the day before waking up to eat dinner and leave again. The exhaustion showed in everything he did, from his slower movements to how he fell asleep on the couch before his alarm even went off. The good thing was he was too tired to start fights about money or anything else, which made the evenings more peaceful than they'd been in months. Mom seemed happier having him out of the house at night. She stopped walking on eggshells, waiting for the next argument to start. One afternoon, I came home from school to find Mom sitting at the kitchen table with worksheets spread out in front of her. She mentioned that her job offered free financial literacy classes during lunch breaks, and she decided to attend one. The worksheets covered basic budgeting, tracking expenses, and savings goals, all things I'd learned years ago out of necessity. But seeing Mom actually engage with the material and take notes surprised me because she'd never shown interest in money management before. She asked me a few questions about how I tracked my business income and expenses, and for the first time, we had a normal conversation about money without anyone getting defensive or angry. It didn't fix everything, but it felt like a small step towards something better. Over the next month, my daily routine settled into a predictable rhythm. I woke up, went to school, worked my afternoon shift at the grocery store, came home to finish schoolwork, did my assigned chores, and went to bed at a reasonable hour. The consistency meant I wasn't constantly exhausted, and my grades slowly climbed back to where they'd been before all the stress. Teachers noticed the change, and a few mentioned they were glad to see me doing better. I wasn't always calculating how to stretch $25 or wondering if there'd be food when I got home. Life wasn't perfect, and my parents still barely talked to me beyond basic household stuff, but it was predictable. And I could focus on school and work without constantly managing crisis situations. Mrs. Martinez texted me one Saturday morning asking if I wanted to spend the weekend at her house to rest and decompress. She said her husband was visiting his sister, and she'd enjoy the company. Plus, she knew things had been stressful at my place. I asked my parents, expecting them to make it a big deal, but Dad just shrugged and said fine. Mom nodded without looking up from her budget spreadsheet. I packed an overnight bag and walked across the street that afternoon, feeling lighter with every step away from my own front door. The weekend turned out to be exactly what I needed. 2 days of watching movies, helping Mrs. Martinez with some gardening projects, and eating meals without any tension in the air. She didn't ask about my home situation, but she made it clear I was welcome at her place whenever I needed a break. Sunday evening, I went back home feeling completely refreshed and ready to handle whatever came next. About 2 weeks later, Ms. Rodriguez came for her follow-up visit and met with all three of us in the living room. She reviewed her notes from the first visit and asked specific questions about food access, my school performance, and household expenses. My parents answered politely, showing her the unlocked pantry, stocked refrigerator, and Mom's budget spreadsheets. Ms. Rodriguez seemed pleased with the progress, but she reminded everyone that the case remained open for continued monitoring, and she planned to check in regularly over the next few months. After she left, my parents went back to their silent resentment, but they didn't make any changes, apparently understanding that Ms. Rodriguez wasn't giving suggestions. One day at lunch, I met with Ms. Thompson to talk about my plans for junior and senior year. She mentioned a dual enrollment program that let high school students take college courses at the community college while earning both high school and college credit. The program covered tuition and provided stipends for books and transportation. Ms. Thompson helped me fill out the application right there in her office and wrote a strong recommendation letter highlighting my work ethic and academic improvement. I submitted everything before the deadline and tried not to get my hopes up too high, but the possibility of getting a head start on college while still in high school felt like exactly the opportunity one needed. About a week after I submitted the application, Mom approached me in the kitchen and asked if I could lend them money for an unexpected car repair. Dad stood behind her nodding, and they both had that same desperate look I remembered from when Dad first lost his job. I told them I could draft a formal loan agreement outlining the amount, interest rate, and repayment schedule, so everyone was on the same page. I pulled out my laptop and started typing a simple contract while they watched. Their expressions shifted from hopeful to uncomfortable, and Dad finally said, "Never mind. We'll figure something else out." They walked away, and I saved the blank loan agreement template for future use, knowing that putting everything in writing protected both them and me. The next weekend, I noticed the big TV had disappeared from the living room. Mom mentioned they'd sold it to help pay down their credit card debt, and Dad had canceled the expensive sports package permanently. The living room looked empty without the huge screen, and I could tell they both hated having made these changes, but it was real progress toward getting their finances under control, even if they clearly resented every step. Dad complained about missing his games. Mom frequently pointed out how small the old TV in their bedroom was compared to what they used to have. I didn't mention that these were the kinds of sacrifices I'd been making since I was 12 because it would just start another fight. 2 months after submitting my application, I got an email saying I'd been accepted into the dual enrollment program and would be receiving a full scholarship covering books and transportation costs. Starting next September, I'd spend mornings taking college classes at the community college and afternoons finishing high school requirements. The acceptance letter included information about course options and orientation dates. I printed it out and showed it to my parents, thinking they'd be proud, or at least recognize it as an achievement. Dad glanced at it and said, "That's good." Mom nodded and mentioned how it would save them money on education later. Their reaction stung a little because this was a huge accomplishment and I'd worked hard to make it happen, but I was learning not to look for validation from them. A week later, we all sat down at the kitchen table with a written document that spelled everything out clearly. No rent until I turn 18. My responsibilities included taking out trash on Tuesdays and Thursdays, doing my own laundry, and helping with meal prep 3 evenings a week. Food access meant the pantry and fridge stayed unlocked, and I could eat whatever was available without asking permission. My work income belonged to me, and I wasn't required to contribute to household bills. Mom read it twice, and Dad shifted in his chair looking uncomfortable, but he didn't argue. We all signed at the bottom, and I took a photo with my phone before Mom drove me to school to give Ms. Thompson the original for her files. Ms. Thompson looked it over, nodded approval, and filed it in a folder with my name on it. She told me to let her know immediately if anything changed or if my parents tried to modify the terms without my agreement. The next Thursday, we ate dinner together at the regular time, baked chicken and rice that Mom cooked using groceries from the store. Dad talked about an incident at the warehouse with a forklift that broke down. Mom described a difficult customer at her retail job who wanted to return something without a receipt. I told them about a quiz I'd done well on in history class and a new client who wanted weekly lawn service starting in the spring. Nobody yelled. Nobody mentioned money. Nobody made snide comments about my clothes or food. It wasn't warm, and we weren't laughing or sharing deep feelings, but we were sitting together eating a meal and talking about ordinary things without tension in the air. After dinner, I helped load the dishwasher per our agreement, then went to my room to finish homework. Looking ahead, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, cautious hope about my situation. Ms. Thompson checked in regularly, and Ms. Rodriguez did monthly home visits. I had a clear path to college through the dual enrollment program starting next fall. My parents were getting better at managing money now that someone was holding them accountable, even though they still resented the scrutiny. I'd learned how to stand up for myself when necessary, and that asking for help wasn't weakness or giving up. Things weren't perfect with my parents, and they probably never would be, but I was building a future that didn't depend on them being consistent or suddenly becoming different people. And honestly, given where we started, that felt like the best outcome I could hope for. So that's my story. That's what happened when my parents tried to charge me $600 rent at 14 years old, and how I fought back with the help of some amazing people who actually cared. If you're going through something similar, please know you're not alone. Talk to a trusted adult, a teacher, counselor, neighbor, anyone who will listen. Document everything. Know your rights. You deserve to be taken care of. You deserve to feel safe in your own home. And you deserve adults in your life who act like actual parents instead of landlords. Thanks for watching, everyone. If this story helped you, or you know someone going through something similar, please share it. And remember, asking for help isn't weakness. It's the bravest thing you can do. Take care of yourselves out there.